Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and worn-out jeans. The airport was buzzing with activity, rolling luggage, hurried conversations, and impatient travelers tapping their feet. Among them stood a man who, despite his modest appearance, exuded a rare kind of calm. He carried a backpack that looked like it had traveled across the world, its straps slightly frayed, yet sturdy. A few feet behind him, Victor Harding adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, the scent of his expensive cologne cutting through the airport air. His leather shoes gleamed under the bright lights, polished to perfection. He was the kind of man who believed in appearances, status, wealth, and the ability to command a room without saying a word. But today, something caught his attention, or rather, someone. His gaze locked onto Keanu, scanning him from head to toe with a look of amused disbelief. A smirk formed at the corner of his lips as he leaned slightly forward. "First class, huh?" Victor's voice carried just enough volume for those nearby to hear. Didn't realize they let just anyone in these days. Keanu turned his head, his expression unreadable, his movements unhurried. "The world's full of surprises," he said with a slight smile, his voice calm, steady. Victor expected a reaction, a flustered look, maybe even an apology. But Keanu's response was so composed, so effortless, that it unsettled him. Victor's smirk twitched as he decided to push a little further. "Nothing personal," he said, stepping beside him in line. "You just don't look like the type to fly first class." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I mean, a backpack, really." Keanu remained unbothered, his gaze shifting to the display screen announcing their flight's boarding status. "Looks can be deceiving," he replied. Victor scoffed, straightening his posture as the line started moving forward. The thought of sitting near this man, a nobody as far as he was concerned, was mildly irritating. What he didn't know was that this flight was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. Victor walked confidently toward the jet bridge, adjusting his designer watch as he handed his ticket to the flight attendant. The first-class cabins smelled of leather and luxury, the kind of exclusivity he had grown accustomed to. As he reached his seat, he paused, his brows furrowing as he double-checked the number on his ticket. Right next to his seat, settling in with the same unbothered calmness, was Keanu Reeves. Victor let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath before taking his seat with an exaggerated sigh. He adjusted his jacket and turned slightly toward Keanu. "Of all the seats on this flight, it had to be this one." Keanu glanced at him and smiled politely. "Looks like we're traveling together then." Victor gave a tight-lipped grin, masking his growing irritation. He wasn't used to sharing spaces with people who didn't fit his version of success. He leaned back, drumming his fingers on the armrest, already forming a judgment in his mind. As the last few passengers boarded, the flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts and making sure everything was in order. The soft chime of the intercom signaled the captain's announcement, welcoming everyone aboard. Victor glanced at Keanu again, curiosity getting the better of him. "So," he said, feigning casual interest, "what do you do?" Keanu adjusted his backpack under the seat in front of him, then looked up. "I work in film." Victor's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh," he said, nodding slowly. "Like commercials? Indie stuff?" Keanu smiled slightly. "Something like that." Victor chuckled, shaking his head. "Look, man, I respect the hustle, but let's be real. Some spaces just aren't meant for everyone. First class, for example," he gestured around, "is for people who've really made it." Keanu simply watched him, his expression giving nothing away. "I think we all end up where we're supposed to be," he said, his voice as steady as ever. Victor let out a short laugh. "That's a nice little philosophy," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "But in the real world, success has a price. You either pay it or you sit back there," he nodded toward economy class, "where most people belong." Keanu didn't reply immediately. He turned his gaze toward the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Victor smirked, convinced he had the upper hand. What he didn't realize was that this flight was about to humble him in a way he never saw coming. The plane ascended smoothly, the hum of the engines filling the cabin. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, ensuring passengers were comfortable. Victor leaned back in his seat, glancing around first class with a sense of satisfaction. This was where he belonged, among the elite, the successful, the people who had earned their place. Keanu, on the other hand, sat with a quiet ease, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. His presence was unassuming, yet there was something about him that unsettled Victor. Maybe it was his calmness, or maybe it was the way he didn't seem to care about proving anything. A flight attendant approached their row, a practiced smile on her face. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Victor straightened, flashing a charming grin. Champagne, of course, something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. He shot Keanu a glance, waiting for his order. Keanu looked up and spoke simply. "Just water, please." Victor let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as the attendant handed over their drinks. "Water?" he repeated, amused. "Man, you're really wasting the first-class experience." Keanu accepted the bottle with a slight nod. "I'm fine with this." He twisted the cap off and took a sip. "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Victor smirked, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less, but not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer." Keanu met his gaze, his expression unreadable. He didn't argue, didn't react. He simply took another sip of his water. Victor exhaled sharply, as if unimpressed. "Let me tell you something about life," he said, leaning in slightly. "It's like flying first class. You work hard, you earn your spot, and then you enjoy it. But some people," he eyed Keanu's worn-out backpack, "only end up here by chance. Luck, not effort." Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray, finally turning to face him fully. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Luck or hard work," he said. "We all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" A faint murmur spread through the nearby passengers. Victor stiffened slightly, realizing that more people were listening now. He forced a chuckle, shaking his head. "That's cute," he said. "First-class wisdom from a guy who—" But before he could finish, the flight attendant returned, this time addressing Keanu directly. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his regards." Victor froze mid-sip. His grip tightened around the champagne glass as his mind processed what he had just heard. Reeves. His eyes widened, darting back to Keanu, who simply smiled politely and nodded at the flight attendant. Around them, other passengers were suddenly whispering, sneaking glances, murmuring in recognition. Victor's face paled, his smirk vanished. He hadn't just been mocking any ordinary passenger, he had been mocking Keanu Reeves. Victor felt his stomach drop. A cold realization settled over him as the name echoed in his mind. Keanu Reeves. The same Keanu Reeves who was one of the most respected and beloved actors in the world. The same man who had starred in blockbuster films, who was known for his humility, generosity, and kindness. And he had spent the last half hour insulting him. His fingers twitched around the stem of his champagne glass as he forced a chuckle, hoping to mask his embarrassment. You're Keanu Reeves?" he asked, his voice losing its usual confidence. Keanu turned to him with the same unreadable calm. "That's what they tell me." A few nearby passengers exchanged glances, some smiling knowingly, others watching with barely hidden amusement. A couple in the row behind them had already pulled out their phones, whispering in excitement. Victor felt like the walls of first class were closing in on him. He cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Well, that's unexpected," he said, forcing a grin. "I mean, you don't exactly dress like a movie star." He let out a nervous laugh, but it didn't land the way he hoped. Keanu didn't react, just studied him with that same quiet patience. "I don't think a seat or an outfit defines a person," he said simply. Victor swallowed hard. He could feel eyes on him now, not with admiration but with judgment. The confidence he had carried onto this flight was slipping away, replaced by something unfamiliar. Shame. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at the other passengers. Their expressions had changed. The subtle nods, the approving glances, they weren't directed at him anymore. They were for Keanu, the man he had mocked, dismissed, and belittled just minutes ago. Victor exhaled sharply, trying to compose himself. "Look, I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier," he muttered. "I was just making conversation." Keanu's lips curled into the slightest of smiles. "Were you?" Victor opened his mouth to respond, but found that for the first time in a long time, he had nothing to say. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Victor was used to being in control, to having the last word, but right now he felt completely out of his depth. What made it worse was that Keanu wasn't angry. He wasn't smug. He wasn't rubbing it in his face. He was just calm. And somehow, that made it even worse. The hum of the airplane filled the space between them as Victor shifted again, staring at his untouched champagne. His usual arrogance felt small now, meaningless. He had spent the entire flight trying to prove he belonged here, and yet the realest man in first class had never needed to prove a thing. Victor's mouth felt dry. He had always prided himself on his ability to command a room, to dominate conversations, to be the most important person in any setting. But now, sitting beside Keanu Reeves, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. He needed to regain control. "So," he said, forcing a chuckle, "I guess you don't go around announcing who you are, huh?" He swirled his champagne, trying to sound casual. "Must be nice, sneaking around without people treating you differently." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying him. "I don't think kindness should depend on who someone is," he said. "It should just exist." Victor felt another weight drop in his chest. He glanced around and saw the passengers still watching. They weren't looking at Keanu like some Hollywood celebrity. They were looking at him like a man who had just handed him a lesson he wasn't ready to learn. He huffed, leaning back in his seat. "Well, must be easy for you," he muttered. "You're famous. You don't have to prove yourself." Keanu took a sip of his water, unfazed. "You think success means proving something to other people?" Victor frowned. "Of course. If people don't see what you have, what you've accomplished, then what's the point?" Keanu set his bottle down and looked at him. Really looked at him. For a second, Victor felt something strange. Like he was being seen in a way that had nothing to do with his expensive suit, his polished shoes, or the balance in his bank account. "I think real success speaks for itself," Keanu said. "It doesn't need to be shouted." The words hit Victor harder than he expected. He tried to shake it off, tried to laugh again, but it sounded hollow, even to himself. The weight of Keanu's words settled over him like turbulence he couldn't escape. For the first time in a long time, Victor wasn't sure if he liked the man staring back at him in his own reflection. Victor stared at his reflection in the darkened airplane window, the flickering city lights below barely visible through the clouds. The truth Keanu had laid out in front of him was unsettling. He had spent years building a persona of success, of power, of being someone who mattered. But now, for the first time, he wondered, mattered to whom? He glanced at Keanu, who had already moved on, calmly flipping through a book as if nothing had happened. No gloating, no smugness, just a man at peace with himself. And yet, Victor had spent the entire flight trying to prove his worth to someone who had never been competing in the first place. The flight attendant returned, clearing their trays. "Would you like another champagne, sir?" she asked Victor. He looked at his half-empty glass, then at Keanu's untouched bottle of water. With a quiet sigh, he shook his head. "No, I'm good." For a moment, silence settled between them. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, Victor finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I need to apologize," he said, still not meeting Keanu's eyes. "Not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Keanu closed his book, turning slightly. He studied Victor, then gave a small nod. "I appreciate that," he said. "But more than the apology, I hope you learn from this." Victor swallowed. "Yeah, me too." Keanu leaned back, his voice steady. Sometimes, what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. Victor's breath hitched. The words echoed in his mind, heavy with meaning. He had spent so much time showing off what he had never stopped to think about who he actually was. The plane began its descent. The city below grew larger, the lights merging into streets and buildings, a world moving forward. As they landed, Victor sat still, lost in thought. When they disembarked, he watched as Keanu walked ahead, blending effortlessly into the crowd. A few fans approached him. He greeted each one with patience, a smile, no rush, no arrogance. Just a man who knew exactly who he was. Victor exhaled and looked down at his own hands. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about how people saw him. He was thinking about who he wanted to be.